The room spoke, just not to everyone. Welcome to Sherlock File. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Comment where you're watching from today. I read every message. Thank you for being here. Let's proceed. The drive to Kensington was a slow and muffled progress, for the fog lay thick as wool upon the streets, deadening sound and distorting distance, so that the lamps appeared to drift like ghostly sentinels beside us. Holmes leaned forward in the cab, his long fingers steepled, his eyes fixed upon the vague glow ahead, as though he could already perceive, beyond the veil, the hidden machinery of the crime. "You observe, Watson," said he at last, "that our problem presents itself in three distinct elements: the locked chamber, the absence of visible cause of death, and the alleged voice emanating from the walls. Each, taken singly, admits of explanation. Taken together, they form a deliberate construction." "You think it deliberate, then?" I asked. "My dear fellow, nothing in human affairs is more suspicious than the appearance of the supernatural when it coincides so conveniently with death." Lestrade gave a short grunt of approval, though I could see he did not wholly follow. Ashcombe House loomed suddenly from the fog, a great sombre structure of darkened brick, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. A constable stood at the gate, and another at the door, both stamping their feet against the cold. We were admitted without delay, and shown into a broad hall where a tall, pale young man awaited us. His face was drawn, and his hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together. "My uncle's death has shaken us all," said he. I am Charles Ashcombe." Holmes bowed slightly, his gaze passing over the young man with that swift, penetrating scrutiny which I had so often observed. "You were present at the time of the occurrence?" "Yes, I was in the adjoining room. I heard it, the voice, I mean. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls themselves." "And yet you are a rational man, Mr. Ashcombe." I believed I was." Holmes inclined his head. "We shall endeavour to restore your confidence in reason. Pray conduct us to the study." We passed down a narrow corridor, richly carpeted and lined with portraits, whose dim faces seemed to watch us as we went. The air grew perceptibly colder, and I confess that even I felt a faint uneasiness as we halted before a heavy oak door. "This is the room," said Lestrade. "Aye, we have left everything as it was found." The key was turned, and we entered. The study was of moderate size, lined on all sides with bookshelves of dark wood. A large desk stood near the centre, and beside it lay the body of Sir Edmund Ashcombe, still as marble, his face turned slightly upward, his expression fixed in one of mingled terror and astonishment. Holmes knelt at once beside the corpse. "No disturbance?" he asked. "None," said Lestrade, "and we have touched nothing." Holmes examined the face, the hands, and the clothing with minute care. He lifted one limp wrist, then allowed it to fall again, gently. "Curious," he murmured. "What do you observe?" I asked. "Absence, Watson, the most eloquent of all evidence. No sign of struggle, no wound, no trace of poison, at least none that declares itself readily." And yet, the expression, did you note it? Not pain, but fear, acute, sudden fear. He rose and turned to the walls. There, just as Lestrade had described, were the words, scrawled in chalk upon the panelling, "I know what lies beneath." Holmes stood before them for several moments without speaking. Then he took from his pocket a lens and examined the writing closely, following each stroke with the utmost attention. "Written in haste," said he softly. "Yet the hand is steady. The chalk, Lestrade, where was it found?" "On the floor near the desk." "Indeed." Holmes crossed to the desk and inspected its surface. Papers lay neatly arranged, save for one drawer which stood slightly ajar. He opened it. "Ah!" "What is it?" cried Lestrade. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he withdrew a small object and held it up between finger and thumb. It was a fragment of white chalk worn to a blunt edge. "The instrument of the message," said Holmes, "but whether in the hand of the victim or another remains to be seen." He replaced it carefully and began to move about the room, his attention now shifting to the walls themselves. He tapped lightly upon the wooden panels, pausing here and there, his head inclined as though listening for some faint reply. "You see nothing unusual?" said Lestrade impatiently. "On the contrary," returned Holmes, "I hear it." "Hear what?" "The difference." He tapped again, once, twice, then moved a few inches and repeated the action. "Solid," he said at one point, "and here, hollow." Lestrade stepped forward. "A hidden passage?" "Possibly, or something less romantic, yet more useful." Holmes pressed his ear against the panel and remained perfectly still. All the silence of the room seemed to deepen until even the ticking of the distant clock was hushed. Then very faintly I thought I perceived it, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur, like the whisper of breath through a narrow opening. Holmes drew back slowly, his eyes alight. "Did you hear it, Watson?" "I cannot be certain." "But I can," said he, "and that, I think, is the first honest voice we have encountered in this affair." Lestrade stared from one to the other of us. "You mean to say the walls truly—" "No," Holmes interrupted sharply. "I mean to say that someone wishes us to believe they do." He turned once more to the body. "Tell me, Mr. Ashcombe," said he, "your uncle, was he in the habit of receiving visitors here in this room?" "Rarely. He was a private man." "And yet," Holmes continued, his gaze lingering upon the hollow panel, "he feared something beneath. That much at least we may take as fact." A sudden chill seemed to pass through the chamber, and I could not shake the impression that we stood upon the threshold of some hidden design, intricate and deliberate, whose outline Holmes alone had begun to discern. "And now," said he quietly, "we must determine whether Sir Edmund Ashcombe died because he knew too much, or because someone wished him to say so." Holmes remained for some moments in silent contemplation, his fingers lightly resting upon the panel where that faint whisper had been detected. The rest of us stood in a curious stillness, as though any sudden movement might disturb some delicate mechanism not yet fully understood. "At what hour did your uncle retire to this room?" Holmes asked at last, without turning. "Oh, shortly after 9, replied Charles Ashcombe. He was in his usual spirits, though perhaps a trifle preoccupied. "And he dismissed the servants?" "Yes, he preferred solitude in the evenings." Holmes nodded absently, then moved to the bell-pull beside the desk. "This was rung violently, you say?" "Quite so," said Lestrade. "The butler came at once, but found the door locked." Holmes gave the cord a gentle tug. Somewhere in the house, faint but distinct, a bell answered. "Functional," he murmured. "So the alarm was genuine, not staged after the fact." He crossed again to the body and examined the floor with minute care, his lens glinting in the lamplight. I observed him pause near the right hand of the deceased. "Watson, kindly observe the fingertips." I knelt beside him. There was a faint white residue upon them. "Chalk dust," said I. "Oh, precisely. Our victim wrote the message himself, or at least held the instrument shortly before death." "Then the words were not the work of another?" asked Lestrade. Holmes rose, brushing his hands together lightly. "That conclusion would be premature. A man may be made to write what he does not intend, or may write under circumstances which distort the truth of the act." He turned suddenly to Charles Ashcombe. "You stated that you heard a voice. Describe it to me with the utmost precision." The young man hesitated. It was low, almost breathless, not loud, but very distinct. It seemed to come from the walls, no, from behind them. It said the same words that were written there. Once. No, twice, I think. Yes, twice. Then came my uncle's bell. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Twice, he repeated. An echo! Perhaps, or a repetition designed to impress itself upon the hearer. Lestrade shifted impatiently. But what does it signify, Mr. Holmes? A hidden passage, you said. Could someone have spoken through it? Let us test that hypothesis. Holmes moved to the panel once more and ran his fingers along its edge, pressing here and there with delicate precision. At last, with a slight click, a narrow seam revealed itself, so fine that it would have escaped any but the closest scrutiny. Ah, said Holmes softly, a craftsman of no mean ability. He inserted the blade of his penknife and gently pried. The panel swung inward by a fraction, revealing a dark cavity beyond. Lestrade gave a low whistle. Well, I'll be... Holmes held up a hand for silence and bent forward, peering into the space. Then he produced a match and struck it. The brief flare illuminated a narrow shaft, scarcely wider than a man's arm, running vertically within the wall. A conduit, said Holmes, for sound, or perhaps for air. For sound, I echoed. Consider, Watson, a voice projected through such a channel would emerge softened, diffused, precisely as described. It would appear to issue from the very structure of the room. Lestrade leaned closer. But who would construct such a thing? Holmes extinguished the match and straightened. That, Lestrade, is the question which brings us nearer to our culprit. He stepped back and surveyed the room once more, his expression thoughtful. A man does not install such an apparatus without purpose. Nor does he make use of it at random. It is a device carefully planned, deliberately employed. Charles Ashcombe had grown visibly agitated. You mean, my uncle knew of this? Holmes regarded him steadily. My dear sir, I should be greatly surprised if he did not. The message upon the wall suggests knowledge of something concealed, something beneath. The conduit lies within the wall. The two facts are unlikely to be unrelated. But beneath what? Cried the young man. Holmes's gaze shifted slowly to the floor. An excellent question. He crossed to the centre of the room and tapped lightly with his foot upon the carpeted boards. Then kneeling, he lifted a corner of the rug and exposed the polished wood beneath. Again he tapped, once, twice, moving methodically across the surface. At one point, the sound altered subtly. Holmes paused. There, said he. Lestrade bent down beside him. A hollow space? So it would appear. Holmes examined the boards more closely, at his fingers tracing the fine lines between them. Presently, he discovered a scarcely visible joint, and with a deft motion he inserted his penknife once more. The section of flooring lifted slightly, revealing a narrow trap concealed with extraordinary skill. Charles Ashcombe uttered a cry of astonishment. I never knew. Nor were you intended to, said Holmes calmly. He raised the panel further, and a cold draught issued from below, carrying with it a faint, earthy odour. A cellar, perhaps, or some older structure beneath the house. Lestrade straightened, his face flushed with excitement. Well, this beats all. A hidden shaft in the wall, a secret trap in the floor, and a dead man who writes riddles before he dies. Mr. Holmes, we are dealing with a nest of conspirators if ever I saw one. Holmes replaced the panel carefully and rose. Perhaps, said he, or perhaps with something more singular still. He glanced once more at the chalked words upon the wall. I know what lies beneath. Tell me, Lestrade, has any examination been made below this room? No, admitted the inspector. We confined ourselves to the study and the immediate facts. Then we have been looking at the effect without yet considering the cause. Holmes took up his hat. Come, gentlemen. If the truth lies beneath, it would be a grave discourtesy not to pay it a visit. As we prepared to leave the room, I cast one last glance at the silent figure upon the floor and the ominous message above him. The discovery of the hidden mechanisms had dispelled any notion of the supernatural, yet in its place there arose something far more troubling, the unmistakable presence of human design, subtle, patient, and profoundly concealed. And as we descended toward the lower regions of Ashcombe House, I could not help but feel that we were drawing nearer, not only to the solution of the mystery, but to the mind that had conceived it. The descent into the lower portion of Ashcombe House was conducted by means of a narrow servants' stair, dimly lit and seldom used, if the accumulation of dust upon its edges were any indication. A single lamp carried by Lestrade cast uncertain shadows upon the walls, which seemed to close in as we proceeded downward. "This part of the house," said Charles Ashcombe, his voice subdued, "is rarely visited. My uncle had no interest in the cellars, so far as I am aware." Holmes, who walked ahead with long, eager strides, gave a faint murmur. "And yet," said he. He was aware of what lay beneath. We reached the foot of the stair, where a low passage extended into darkness. The air here was markedly colder and possessed that peculiar, stale quality which suggests long confinement without circulation. Holmes paused and held up his hand. "Before we proceed," said he, "a moment's consideration. We have discovered a conduit within the wall and a concealed trap in the floor above. It would be a singular coincidence if these did not converge upon some common point." "You mean," said Lestrade, "that this passage connects to the study?" "I should consider it highly probable." Holmes advanced, his eyes keenly observing every inch of the stone floor and rough brickwork. After a few yards, the passage widened slightly and terminated in a small chamber, little more than a vault, with a low ceiling and bare walls. In one corner stood a wooden structure, a kind of narrow cabinet or box affixed to the wall. Holmes approached it at once. "Here we have it," said he. He opened the door. Within was revealed a curious arrangement, a metal tube rising vertically through the ceiling, precisely aligned with the conduit we had observed above. Beside it lay a small apparatus, a speaking horn such as one might find in certain experimental acoustic devices. Lestrade stared. "Well, I never!" Holmes lifted the horn and examined it with interest. A simple but effective contrivance. A voice directed into this instrument would travel upward through the tube and emerge within the study, softened and distorted by the passage. "So the voice came from here?" said I. "Undoubtedly." "But who was here to speak?" asked Lestrade. But Holmes replaced the horn carefully. "That, Lestrade, is the next question in our inquiry." He turned and began to examine the floor of the chamber. Near the base of the apparatus, the dust had been disturbed. "Observe," said he, pointing. "Footprints." I bent closer. The marks were faint, yet discernible, narrow impressions as though made by a small boot. "Not a man's," I remarked. "No," said Holmes. "A woman's, I should say. Light, but distinct and recent." Charles Ashcombe uttered an exclamation. "A woman? But who—" Holmes raised a hand. "Let us not outrun the evidence. The presence of these marks indicates that someone stood here at or about the time of the incident and made use of this apparatus." Lestrade scratched his chin. "But how did they come and go? There's only the one stair, and no one saw anything." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Lestrade, you persist in assuming that what is not seen does not exist. Let us examine the perimeter." He moved to the far wall and began to inspect it with the same minute care he had shown above. Presently, he tapped upon the brickwork. Again, that subtle difference in sound. "Hollow," he said quietly. With a few deft movements, he discovered a concealed latch, and a section of the walls swung inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Lestrade gave a low whistle. "Well, this house is full of surprises." Holmes inclined his head. "A house with secrets, Lestrade, and secrets imply design." The passage beyond was even narrower than the first, scarcely more than a slit between the walls. It sloped gently upward, and after some distance, he emerged behind a panel in a different part of the house. We stepped out into a dimly lit corridor lined with closed doors. Charles Ashcombe looked about him in astonishment. "This leads to the east wing, the old guest quarters. They have not been used in years." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely the sort of place where one might come and go without observation. He closed the panel behind us and turned to his companions. "Now let us reconstruct the sequence. A person, most likely a woman, enters the east wing unnoticed. She makes her way through this hidden passage to the chamber below the study. From there, she speaks through the apparatus, causing the voice to issue from the walls above." "And Sir Edmund hears it?" said I. "Exactly. He hears a voice declaring, 'I don't know what lies beneath.' A message calculated to alarm, perhaps to confirm a suspicion already present in his mind." "And then?" asked Lestrade. Holmes's expression grew grave. "And something occurs which causes him to ring the bell in terror, and shortly thereafter he is dead." "But there was no one in the room," cried Lestrade. Holmes turned slowly. "Was there not?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. "You mean—" I began. "I mean," said Holmes, "that we have not yet accounted for the most essential element of the crime, the means by which death was administered." He began to pace the corridor, his brows drawn together in deep thought. "A voice may frighten a man," he continued, "but it does not kill him, nor does a hidden passage, nor a chalked message. Or these are but the accessories, the stage upon which the true act is performed." Charles Ashcombe looked pale. "Then my uncle was murdered?" Holmes stopped and faced him. "My dear sir, I think it increasingly likely." "But how? There was no poison, no wound." Holmes raised a finger. "No obvious poison, no visible wound. But we must remember that there exist agents, subtle, elusive, which leave little trace and act with great rapidity." Lestrade's eyes widened. "You mean some sort of gas? Something introduced through that tube?" Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "An interesting suggestion, Lestrade, and one which, I confess, has already occurred to me." A silence followed, during which each of us seemed to contemplate the sinister possibilities implied by his words. At length, Holmes spoke again. "There is one further point to be considered. Now, if the voice was intended to alarm, and the apparatus to deliver some lethal agent, then the entire arrangement presupposes prior knowledge of the house, of its structure, and of Sir Edmund's habits." He looked directly at Charles Ashcombe. "Tell me, who among your household, or your acquaintances, would possess such knowledge?" The young man hesitated, his face clouded with uncertainty. I cannot say. The house has been in our family for generations. Many have come and gone." Holmes nodded slowly. "Just so. Then we must inquire more closely into those who have had both access and motive." He turned toward the corridor, his expression once more composed, yet charged with that quiet intensity which I had learned to associate with the nearing of a solution. "For now," said he, We have established that the whispering walls are no more than a clever illusion, and that beneath them lies not the supernatural, but something far more dangerous. And as we retraced our steps through the hidden passage, I felt that the mystery, though still obscure, had taken on a darker and more tangible shape, one that pointed unmistakably to the workings of a deliberate and calculating mind. When we regained the study, Holmes paused once more upon the threshold, as though reluctant to disturb the silent testimony of the room before him. The lamp still burned upon the desk, casting its steady glow upon the lifeless figure of Sir Edmund Ashcombe and the ominous message upon the wall. "Everything," said Holmes quietly, "must be reconsidered in light of what we have discovered below. The voice, the concealed passage, or the apparatus, all these form but one part of the design. The true question remains, what occurred in this room after the voice was heard?" Lestrade folded his arms. "Well, we know this much. The man was alone, the door locked, and within minutes he was dead. If there was murder, it must have been done without the killer ever setting foot inside." Holmes gave a slight, approving nod. "An excellent summation, Lestrade. Now let us see how far it may carry us." He moved again to the desk, his fingers gliding lightly over its surface. He opened and closed the drawers in turn, examining their contents with rapid precision. Papers, correspondence, and ledgers lay within. Nothing at first glance of any striking peculiarity. Yet Holmes's attention soon fixed upon a small stack of documents bound together with a ribbon. He lifted them. I untied the knot and began to read. "Ah," he murmured, "now this is of interest." "What have you found?" I asked. "Accounts, Watson. Old accounts, land transactions, mineral rights, and certain agreements dating back some 20 years. Lestrade leaned closer. "And what's so remarkable about that?" Holmes tapped the page lightly. "These lands, Lestrade. Observe their location. All lie beneath or adjacent to this very property." Charles Ashcombe stepped forward. "That is true. My uncle acquired them gradually over many years. He was most particular about them, though I never understood why." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "Indeed? And did he ever speak of their value or purpose?" "Only in vague terms. He would say that they contained more than they appeared." "I assumed he referred to their potential for development." Holmes smiled faintly. "A reasonable assumption, though perhaps not the correct one." He replaced the papers carefully and turned once more toward the concealed panel in the wall. "We have established that a voice was projected into this room from below. That voice declared knowledge of something beneath. The victim, already aware of certain matters relating to his property, hears this and is alarmed. He writes the message upon the wall, possibly as a record, possibly as a warning, and then he dies," said Lestrade. "Precisely. The question is, what action did he take between hearing the voice and his death?" Holmes began to pace slowly across the room, his head bowed in thought. "I'll consider the bell," he continued. "He rings it violently, summoning assistance. This suggests sudden fear, perhaps the onset of some effect he did not anticipate." "You still think of poison?" I asked. Holmes stopped. "I think of something introduced into this room by means of the apparatus below, a gas, perhaps, or vapour, colourless, odourless, and swift in its action." Lestrade's brow furrowed. "But if that were the case, would not the servants have been affected when they entered?" "A very pertinent observation," said Holmes, "which leads us to suppose that the agent, whatever its nature, dissipated rapidly or was released in a quantity sufficient to affect only the immediate vicinity of the victim." He moved to the chair beside the desk, and examined its position. Note that Sir Edmund was seated here. The conduit in the wall lies but a few feet distant. A concentrated emission from that point might well produce the desired effect before dispersing. Charles Ashcombe shuddered. You mean he was suffocated? Or otherwise incapacitated, said Holmes. The precise mechanism remains to be determined. He bent suddenly and examined the carpet near the base of the wall. His fingers brushed lightly over the surface, then paused. Watson, the lamp. I brought it closer. Holmes pointed to a faint discoloration upon the fabric, a subtle darkening, scarcely perceptible unless closely observed. Do you see this? Yes, a stain of some kind. Or the residue of some substance, said Holmes. Lestrade, I should be obliged if you would have this portion of the carpet carefully removed and submitted for analysis. The inspector nodded. Morms at once? Holmes rose and glanced again at the body. There is, however, another aspect of the matter which troubles me. And that is? I asked. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. The conduct of our unknown visitor below. She, or he, goes to considerable lengths to produce the illusion of a disembodied voice. Why? Why not simply administer the fatal agent without such theatrics? To frighten him, suggested Lestrade. Yes, but to what end? Fear alone does not explain the message. I know what lies beneath. It is not a threat. It is a declaration. He turned abruptly to Charles Ashcombe. Tell me, did your uncle have enemies? The young man hesitated. None that I knew of. He was not a man to make friends easily, but neither did he quarrel openly. Debts, disputes, legal matters? There were some disagreements regarding land boundaries, but nothing of consequence. Holmes nodded slowly. And we must look elsewhere for motive. The message suggests knowledge, perhaps knowledge of something concealed beneath the house or its grounds. If such a thing exists, it may well provide the key to the entire affair. Lestrade shrugged. Buried treasure, perhaps? Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. My dear Lestrade, treasure is rarely buried without reason, and more rarely still without consequences. He moved to the window and drew aside the curtains slightly, peering out into the fog-shrouded night. For the present, said he, we must content ourselves with the facts at hand. We have a victim who knew something of importance, a mechanism designed to convey both sound and possibly death. And a person with sufficient knowledge of the house to employ it. He let the curtain fall and turned back to us. Our next step must be to examine those who had access to this knowledge and the opportunity to act upon it. There was a quiet resolve in his tone which left no doubt as to the direction of his thoughts. And I think, he added softly, that we shall find the answer not in the walls nor beneath the floor, but among the living inhabitants of this house. Holmes's last remark seemed to cast a new light upon the entire affair, for it turned our attention from the hidden mechanisms of the house to the human elements within it. Charles Ashcombe, who had hitherto appeared merely shaken, now betrayed a deeper unease, as though the suggestion itself had awakened some unspoken apprehension. You believe, said he slowly, that someone within this house is responsible? Holmes regarded him steadily. I believe, Mr. Ashcombe, that knowledge of this complexity is seldom possessed by strangers. The passages we have traversed, the apparatus we have examined, these are not the work of chance intrusion. They imply familiarity, and familiarity implies access. Lestrade gave a brisk nod. Then we must question the staff at once. By all means, said Holmes, but I would suggest that we proceed with method rather than haste. Panic is the enemy of clarity. We were conducted back to the main hall, where the household had gathered in subdued anxiety. There were 4 in number: the butler, a grave and elderly man of rigid bearing; the housemaid, pale and wide-eyed; a cook of stout figure and nervous disposition; she and a younger woman whom Charles Ashcombe introduced as Miss Eleanor Briggs, his uncle's companion and secretary. At the sight of her, Holmes's expression altered almost imperceptibly. She was of medium height, with dark hair drawn plainly back, and features which, though not striking, possessed a certain quiet intelligence. Her composure stood in marked contrast to the agitation of the others. Holmes bowed slightly. "Miss Briggs, I understand you were present in the house at the time of Sir Edmund's death?" "I was, Mr. Holmes," she replied in a calm, even voice. "And you heard the voice?" "I did." Holmes's eyes rested upon her a moment longer than courtesy required. "Pray describe it." "It seemed to come from the study itself," said she. "Or rather, from the walls. It was low, as though whispered through some barrier. I could not distinguish the speaker, only the words." "Which were?" "I know what lies beneath." Holmes inclined his head. "And you were alarmed?" "Naturally. Sir Edmund rang for assistance almost immediately afterward." The butler stepped forward. "If I may, sir, I was the first to reach the door. It was locked. We forced it open together." "Who accompanied you?" asked Holmes. "Mr. Charles, the maid, and Miss Briggs." Holmes turned to the maid. "You also heard the voice?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. "It gave me a terrible fright." "And you, madam?" he asked of the cook. "I heard nothing, sir," said she. "I was in the kitchen at the back." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "So we have 3 witnesses to the voice and 1 who did not hear it. That is of some interest." Lestrade frowned. "How so?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he addressed the butler. "Tell me, how long have you been in Sir Edmund's service?" 23 years, sir." "And during that time, have you ever observed anything unusual about the structure of the house? Any concealed passages, perhaps?" The butler stiffened slightly. "No, sir. Nothing of the kind." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You are certain?" "Quite certain." Holmes said nothing further, but I could see that he had noted the man's hesitation. He turned then to Miss Briggs. "You have been with Sir Edmund how long?" 3 years. "And your duties?" "I attended to his correspondence, managed certain accounts, and assisted him in matters of business." "Then you would be familiar with his properties?" "To some extent." Holmes's tone remained mild. "Did he ever speak to you of what lay beneath those properties?" For the first time, a faint shadow passed across her face. "He was a private man, Mr. Holmes. He did not confide in me beyond what was necessary." Holmes regarded her in silence for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Of course. I merely inquire in the interests of completeness." He stepped back and addressed the group as a whole. "For the present, that will suffice. I should be obliged if you would all remain within the house until further notice." Lestrade added, "No one leaves without my permission." As the servants withdrew, Holmes turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Well, Watson, what is your impression?" "I find Miss Briggs most composed," said I. "Perhaps unusually so, given the circumstances." "Just so," said Holmes. "Composure is often a sign either of strength or of preparation." "And the butler?" I asked. "A man of long service, and yet not entirely candid. His denial of the house's peculiarities is difficult to reconcile with the evidence we have observed." Lestrade crossed his arms. "You suspect them both?" "I suspect everyone, Lestrade," said Holmes dryly. "It is the only method by which one may arrive at certainty." He moved toward the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. "There is, however, one point which stands out above all others. The voice was heard by 3 persons, yet not by the cook, who was in a more distant part of the house. This suggests that the sound was not broadcast widely, but directed with some precision. "Through the conduit?" I said. "Precisely, and if so, the person operating it must have had a clear understanding of its range and effect." He paused, then added quietly, "Which brings us again to knowledge of the house, and its hidden features and its acoustics." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Well, Mr. Holmes, we've narrowed it down nicely, to anyone who knows the place well." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "On the contrary, Lestrade, we have narrowed it to someone who knows it exceptionally well, someone who not only knew of these features, but had the confidence to employ them in a most delicate and dangerous manner." He turned suddenly. "Come, Watson, there is one more matter which requires our attention this evening." "And that is?" Holmes took up his hat. "The question of what lies beneath, and why Sir Edmund feared it enough to die for it." As we prepared to leave the hall, I could not help but feel that the invisible threads of the mystery were tightening, drawing together the elements we had thus far uncovered. Yea, and though the faces of the household still lingered in my mind, it was the calm, measured gaze of Miss Eleanor Briggs that seemed to hold, in some subtle way, a significance not yet fully revealed. Holmes did not immediately return to the lower chambers, as I had expected, but instead led the way toward a smaller sitting room adjoining the main hall. Once inside, he closed the door softly behind us and motioned for silence. "There is a rhythm to such cases, Watson," said he in a low voice, "a cadence in which each fact must be placed at the proper moment. To proceed blindly into the depths below without first arranging the elements above would be to risk confusion." Lestrade, who had followed us in, gave a faint shrug. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, I prefer something more direct. We've a hidden chamber, a dead man, and a set of suspects under one roof. It seems to me the matter calls for action." Holmes smiled faintly. "An action, Lestrade, is most effective when guided by understanding. Let us review what we possess." He drew a chair to the table and seated himself, his long fingers steepled once more. "First, Sir Edmund Ashcombe was in possession of knowledge, something concealed beneath his property, to which he attached considerable importance. Second, an apparatus exists by which sound, and possibly a substance, may be conveyed from below into his private study. Third, a voice was projected through this device declaring the knowledge of that which lay beneath. Fourth, within moments of hearing this, Sir Edmund wrote a message confirming the same knowledge, rang his bell in alarm, and died without visible cause. And fifth," added Lestrade, "or someone used that hidden passage to do it." Holmes inclined his head. "Just so. Now consider the intention. The voice does not threaten, it asserts. It tells Sir Edmund something he already fears or suspects. The effect is immediate and profound." "You think it was meant to provoke him?" I asked. "Precisely. To force a reaction, perhaps even to compel him to reveal something." Lestrade frowned. "But he didn't reveal anything. He only wrote those words on the wall." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, but did he not? I know what lies beneath." "That is both a statement and a warning. It suggests that he believed himself to be in possession of dangerous knowledge. Knowledge that another wished either to confirm or to suppress." He rose and began to pace slowly. "Now let us consider Miss Eleanor Briggs." Lestrade looked up sharply. "You suspect her?" "Oh, then?" "I observe her," said Holmes calmly. "She is composed, intelligent, and occupies a position which grants her access to Sir Edmund's private affairs. She is familiar with his papers, his properties, and, if we are to judge by her demeanour, with the discipline required to conceal her thoughts. And the footprints, I added. You said they were likely a woman's. Indeed, Lestrade scratched his chin thoughtfully. But that's not enough to hang a case on. We need proof. Something solid. Holmes stopped and turned to him. And we shall have it, Lestrade. But first, we must understand the motive. He moved to the window and gazed out into the fog, which still pressed thickly against the glass. Suppose for a moment that Sir Edmund's lands conceal something of value, not necessarily gold or jewels, but something rarer, something hidden long ago, perhaps forgotten by most, yet known to a select few. You mean like a secret passage, said Lestrade, or something more enduring, a chamber, a deposit, or even evidence of a deed committed in the past. I felt a slight chill at his words. And Miss Briggs? I asked. Holmes turned back. If she had discovered such a secret through her access to Sir Edmund's documents, she would possess both knowledge and motive. Knowledge of what lay beneath, and motive to obtain or control it. But why kill him? Said Lestrade, and why not simply take whatever it is? Holmes's expression grew more intent. Because, Lestrade, Sir Edmund stood between her and that objective. He possessed the same knowledge, and perhaps the means to prevent her from acting upon it. There was a brief silence as we considered this.
At the same time, Holmes continued, we must not neglect the butler. His denial of the house's hidden features was unconvincing. A man of 23 years' service could scarcely remain ignorant of such matters. You think he's in it too? Asked Lestrade. Well, possibly. Or possibly he's merely concealing something out of loyalty or fear? Holmes resumed his seat. There is, however, one element which remains unresolved, the means of death. Until we determine precisely how Sir Edmund was killed, we cannot complete the chain of reasoning. Then we must examine the body again, said I. Holmes nodded. Exactly, and not merely the body, but the immediate environment, the air, the furnishings, the very fabric of the room. There are agents, Watson, which act with subtlety and speed,
and leaving little trace save for the most careful observer. Lestrade rose. Well then, let's get to it. The sooner we find that proof, the sooner we can lay hands on our culprit. Holmes stood as well, his expression once more composed, yet charged with quiet anticipation. Patience, Lestrade. The net is already drawn. It only remains to close it. As we left the room and returned once more toward the study, I could not shake the sense that the invisible threads of the mystery were tightening around a central point. Holmes's reasoning, though not yet complete, had begun to take on a definite shape, and the figure of Miss Eleanor Briggs, calm, self-possessed and inscrutable, stood increasingly at its centre. Yet even as suspicion gathered, there remained that final, elusive element, the unseen hand that had dealt death within a locked room. And until that hand was revealed, the case, for all its progress, remained poised upon the edge of uncertainty. When we re-entered the study, Holmes moved with a renewed precision, as though the interval of reflection had aligned the scattered pieces of the puzzle into a more coherent design. The room, unchanged and still, seemed now less mysterious and more deliberate, each object a potential instrument rather than a passive detail. "Watson," said he quietly, "pray close the door." I did so, and Holmes immediately crossed to the concealed panel within the wall. With deft fingers he opened it once more and peered into the narrow conduit beyond. "We must consider," he continued, "not only what passed through this channel, but how it was delivered." Lestrade stepped closer.
You still think something came through there besides the voice?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, He withdrew a small strip of paper from his pocket and held it near the opening. For a moment, nothing occurred. Then, faintly, the paper stirred. "A current of air," he murmured. "Subtle, but present." "From below?" I asked. "Undoubtedly, the conduit is not merely for sound, it allows the passage of air between the chamber beneath and this room. Now consider the implications." Lestrade's expression sharpened. "You mean something could have been blown up through it?" "Precisely. A vapour, perhaps, introduced below and carried upward by means of a bellows or similar device. The voice serves to distract, to focus attention, while the true agent performs its work unseen." Holmes closed the panel and turned back to the room.
"Aye, but if that is so," he went on, "we must determine why only Sir Edmund was affected." I glanced at the body. He was nearest the conduit. Just so, seated at his desk within a few feet of the opening, a concentrated emission would reach him first, and in sufficient quantity to produce rapid effect before dispersing. Lestrade nodded slowly, and by the time anyone else entered, it would be gone. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "You follow admirably, Lestrade." He moved again to the chair in which Sir Edmund had been seated and examined its position relative to the wall. "Observe the angle," said he. "He sat here, facing the desk. The conduit lies just to his right. A stream of vapour emerging at that point would strike him directly, particularly if he turned toward it upon hearing the voice." "And the stain on the carpet," I added. "Exactly."
A residue, perhaps, left by the substance as it settled. We shall know more once it has been analysed." Holmes straightened and folded his arms. "We are now in a position to describe the method of the crime with some confidence. The perpetrator descends to the chamber below, positions herself, if we accept that it is a woman, before the apparatus, and delivers the message. At the same time, or immediately thereafter, she introduces a volatile agent into the conduit. The victim hears the voice, turns toward it, and inhales the substance. Within moments, he is overcome." "And writes the message before he dies," said Lestrade. Holmes shook his head slightly. "No, Lestrade. That is the one point which requires closer examination." He knelt once more beside the body and took up the right hand, studying the fingers with intense concentration.
Watson, you observed the chalk upon the fingertips. That suggests that the message was written shortly before death, but not necessarily at the very last moment." "You think he wrote it earlier?" I asked. "It is possible. Or he began to write it upon hearing the voice, before the full effect of the agent took hold. In either case, the act was deliberate, an attempt to record what he knew." Holmes rose again and turned toward the desk. "There is another question. Why upon the wall? Why not upon paper, where it would be more natural?" Lestrade shrugged. "In his panic, perhaps." Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "Perhaps. Yet Sir Edmund was a man of order. His desk is well arranged, his papers neatly kept, and it is curious that he should choose so conspicuous and unconventional a medium, unless he wished the message to be immediately seen." "To warn others," I suggested. "Or to ensure that it could not be concealed," said Holmes quietly. A silence followed, during which the weight of that possibility settled upon us. "Then he knew he was dying," said Lestrade. Holmes inclined his head. "I think it highly probable. And in that moment he sought to leave behind the one fact which might lead to the truth, that he knew what lay beneath." He turned suddenly, his expression sharpening. "Which brings us again to the question, what is it that lies beneath?" Charles Ashcombe, who had stood silently near the door, spoke at last. "Oh, if my uncle discovered something of value or danger, why did he not act upon it sooner?" Holmes regarded him steadily. An excellent question. It suggests that whatever he discovered was either difficult to access or fraught with risk. Perhaps he was still investigating, perhaps he feared the consequences of revealing it. Lestrade gave a short laugh. Well, whatever it is, it's caused enough trouble already. Holmes did not smile. Indeed, Lestrade, and I suspect it has not yet finished doing so. He moved once more to the concealed panel and laid his hand upon it, as though feeling for some final confirmation. The mechanism is clear, the method is nearly so. What remains is to identify the mind behind it, and the motive which set it in motion. He turned to us, his eyes bright with that cold, keen light which I had come to associate with the nearing of a decisive moment. And for that, said he, we must confront not only what lies beneath the house, but what lies concealed within those who dwell above it. As I looked about the room, the silent figure, the chalked message, the hidden panel, I felt that the mystery, though still unresolved, had drawn us inexorably toward its centre. The unseen hand which had orchestrated these events was no longer beyond our reach. It lingered somewhere within the house, waiting, perhaps, even now for its design to be completed. Holmes's words seemed to linger in the air long after he had spoken them, as though the room itself retained their meaning. For a brief interval none of us moved. Then, with a sudden decision, he crossed to the door. "Lestrade," said he, I must request that the household remain precisely as it is. No one is to retire, no one is to leave, and above all, no one is to enter the lower passages." The inspector nodded. "You think our culprit might try something further?" Holmes's expression grew grave. "I think our culprit is not yet certain how much we have discovered, and that uncertainty may provoke action." With that, he stepped into the corridor, and we followed. The lamps along the passage flickered faintly, their light wavering in the stillness, and I could not shake the sense that we moved within a place whose secrets had only just begun to stir. "Watson," Holmes said quietly as we walked, "it is often the case that the most dangerous moment in an investigation is not the beginning, but the point at which the truth begins to emerge. A mind capable of such contrivance as we have observed will not readily surrender its advantage." "You believe she will act again?" I asked. "I believe," said Holmes, "that she must." We had scarcely reached the main hall when a sudden sound broke the silence, a faint cry, quickly stifled, yet unmistakably one of alarm. It came from above. Lestrade started. "What was that?" Holmes was already in motion. "Upstairs! Quickly!" We hurried toward the staircase, our steps echoing sharply against the stone. The cry came again, clearer now, from the direction of the east wing, the very portion of the house into which the hidden passage had emerged. Charles Ashcombe, who had followed close behind, called out, "It is Miss Briggs!" Holmes mounted the stairs 2 at a time, his lean figure moving with extraordinary speed, till we reached the upper corridor and turned toward the east wing, where a door stood ajar, light spilling into the dim passage. Holmes reached it first and pushed it wide. Miss Eleanor Briggs stood within, her face pale, her hand pressed to her breast. Before her, upon a small table, lay a collection of papers scattered as though hastily disturbed. "What has happened?" demanded Holmes. I heard something," she said, her voice unsteady for the first time since we had met her. "A sound from the wall. I thought it had begun again." Holmes's eyes moved swiftly about the room. "You were alone?" "Yes." "And these papers?" "They belong to Sir Edmund. I came to review them. There may be something among them to explain." Her words faltered under Holmes's steady gaze. "Indeed," said he softly,
And did you find anything of interest? She hesitated, then shook her head. No, nothing conclusive? Holmes stepped forward and examined the papers upon the table. His fingers moved lightly over them, separating one from another with practiced ease. Old correspondence, he murmured. Legal documents. And here. Ah. He paused, holding up a single sheet. What is that? Asked Lestrade. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he read the contents carefully, his expression growing more intent with each line. At last, he said quietly. Miss Briggs took an involuntary step forward. You have found something? Holmes looked up. Yes, Miss Briggs, I believe I have. He folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. For the moment, however, I shall keep its contents to myself. Lestrade frowned. Come now, Mr. Holmes. In due time.
Aye, Lestrade, said Holmes calmly. For now, I should like to ask Miss Briggs a question or two. He turned back to her. You stated that you heard a sound from the wall. Pray describe it. It was faint, like a movement or a breath. It reminded me of what we heard earlier. Holmes nodded slowly. And yet you chose to remain here, alone, examining these papers. I thought it my duty, she said, though her voice lacked its former composure. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Or perhaps you thought it your opportunity. A flush rose to her cheeks. I do not understand your meaning. Holmes stepped closer, his voice still gentle, yet carrying a quiet authority. Miss Briggs, you are a woman of intelligence. You have had access to Sir Edmund's private affairs for 3 years. You are familiar with his properties, his documents.
And if I am not mistaken, the hidden features of this house. Her eyes widened slightly. You accuse me. I accuse no one, said Holmes. I merely observe. And I observe that you were present when the voice was heard, that you had both knowledge and opportunity, and that you have shown a most commendable interest in these papers. Lestrade stepped forward. Perhaps you'd better explain yourself, miss. For a moment, Miss Briggs said nothing. Then, with a visible effort, she regained her composure. I have nothing to explain, she said firmly. I came here because I wished to understand what has happened. If you suspect me, you are mistaken. Holmes regarded her in silence, his eyes searching her face with that penetrating intensity which so often disconcerted those upon whom it fell. At present, said he at last,
I suspect only that the truth lies closer than it appears. He turned to Lestrade. Ensure that this room is secured. No one is to enter without my permission. Then to me, in a lower voice, Come, Watson, the time has come to bring this matter to its conclusion. As we left the room, I cast one last glance at Miss Briggs. She stood motionless beside the table, her face pale but resolute, and in her eyes there flickered something which I could not then define, a mixture perhaps of fear and defiance. And though Holmes had not yet spoken his final deduction, I felt that the net had indeed begun to close, and that the unseen drama, long concealed within the walls of Ashcombe House, was at last approaching its inevitable revelation. Holmes did not speak again until we had regained the study, but where the quiet presence of the dead seemed to lend weight to every word and gesture. He closed the door behind us with deliberate care and stood for a moment with his back to it, his head slightly bowed, as though arranging his thoughts into their final order. Lestrade broke the silence. Well, Mr. Holmes, you've found something in those papers, that's plain enough. And you've your suspicions besides. It would be a kindness to share them. Holmes turned slowly, and there was now in his expression that cold, precise clarity which I had learned to associate with the moment before revelation. "In a few minutes, Lestrade," said he, "but first I must be certain of one last point." He crossed once more to the concealed panel in the wall and opened it. The faint current of air stirred again, just perceptible in the stillness of the room.
Watson," said he, "pray observe closely." From his pocket he withdrew a small vial and uncorked it with care. A faint odour, sharp and acrid, reached my nostrils. "Ammonia," he explained. "A harmless test, in small quantity." He held the open vial near the mouth of the conduit and waited. After a few seconds, he stepped back and motioned toward the chair by the desk. "Now, Watson, stand where Sir Edmund sat." I did so, though not without some unease. "Do you perceive anything?" At first, nothing. Then faintly the sharp scent reached me, diluted yet distinct. "Yes," said I, "it is perceptible." Holmes nodded. "And you, Lestrade?" The inspector took my place. "I smell it," he said. "Faint, but there." Holmes replaced the cork and slipped the vial back into his pocket. "That will suffice."
Well, we have now demonstrated that a substance introduced below may be conveyed to this position in measurable quantity. If that substance were of a more potent nature, say a volatile toxin, the result would be precisely what we have observed. Lestrade's face hardened. "Then it's murder, beyond doubt." Holmes closed the panel. "Yes, murder carried out with ingenuity and foresight." He turned toward the body, his gaze lingering upon the still features of Sir Edmund Ashcombe. "There remains only the identity of the murderer and the motive which drove her to so elaborate a crime." Lestrade gave a short, impatient gesture. "Then let us have it, man." Holmes raised a hand. "In due course, but first allow me to complete the chain." He moved to the desk and rested his fingertips lightly upon its surface. So we have established that Sir Edmund possessed knowledge of something concealed beneath his property. This knowledge was shared, whether wholly or in part, by another. That person, desiring control of whatever lay hidden, sought to remove Sir Edmund as an obstacle, and used the apparatus below to do it, said I. "Precisely. The voice was not merely a trick, it was a signal, a means of confirming that Sir Edmund was aware of the secret, and of provoking him into a reaction which would place him in the precise position required." Lestrade frowned. "You mean to make him turn toward the conduit?" "Exactly. The message, I know what lies beneath, was calculated to strike at the very centre of his concern. In that moment of alarm he turns, perhaps rises slightly, or perhaps leans toward the source and inhales the fatal vapour." "And the message on the wall?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. His final act, a warning, or perhaps a defiance. He knew he had been discovered, and that discovery had cost him his life. Lestrade folded his arms. "Very well, but you've yet to tell us who did it." Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew the paper he had taken from Miss Briggs's room. "This," said he, "provides the answer." He unfolded it and laid it upon the desk. "It is a document relating to Sir Edmund's earliest acquisition of land beneath this house. But more than that, it refers to a sealed chamber discovered during excavation. A chamber which was not opened, but instead concealed, its existence known only to Sir Edmund and one other." "And who was that?" asked Lestrade sharply. Holmes looked up. "His secretary, Miss Eleanor Briggs." There was a moment of silence. "But that's not proof," said Lestrade. "It only shows she knew about it." Holmes inclined his head. "Quite so, but consider the rest. She had access to the documents, knowledge of the property, and, most importantly, the intelligence to understand the significance of what lay beneath. She also possessed the opportunity, as evidenced by the footprints in the chamber below." "And the voice," I added. "She was one of those who claimed to hear it?" Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed, a clever touch. By placing herself among the witnesses, she removes suspicion. Yet the cook, who was too distant to hear the conduit, heard nothing, thus confirming that the sound was not general but directed. Lestrade's eyes narrowed.
And the second sound she claimed to hear just now? Holmes's expression hardened. A ruse, I think. She returned to that room not out of curiosity, but to recover this document, or others like it. She sensed that our investigation was closing in, and sought to secure what she could before it was too late. Lestrade struck his fist into his palm. "Then we've got her!" Holmes raised a cautioning hand. "Not yet, Lestrade. We have reason, strong reason, but we must have certainty, and for that we require one final step." He folded the paper carefully. "We must confront her, not with accusation, but with knowledge. We must show her that her design is understood, her method exposed, and her motive laid bare." "And then?" I asked. Holmes's eyes shone with a cold, quiet intensity. "Then, Watson?"
But we shall see whether she chooses confession, or whether she compels us to complete the matter by other means. As he spoke, I felt that we stood upon the very brink of resolution. The scattered fragments of the case had drawn together into a single, coherent whole, and at its centre stood the figure of Miss Eleanor Briggs, no longer merely composed and self-possessed, but now revealed, in Holmes's reasoning, as the architect of a most subtle and deadly design. And yet, until she herself spoke, the final truth, like the hidden chamber beneath the house, remained just beyond our grasp. Holmes wasted no further time in speculation. With a decisive motion, he placed the document within his coat and moved toward the door. "Come, Lestrade," said he, "the matter now rests upon a single interview." We returned at once to the east wing, where Miss Eleanor Briggs had been left under quiet observation. The corridor seemed more oppressive than before, as though the house itself were aware that its secret stood upon the verge of exposure. Lestrade pushed open the door, and we entered together. Miss Briggs stood where we had last seen her, though the papers upon the table had been gathered into a neater stack. She turned as we came in, and for an instant her eyes flickered toward Holmes's coat, as though she guessed what it contained. Holmes closed the door behind us. "Miss Briggs," said he calmly, "I fear that our inquiries have reached a point where plain speaking is necessary." She met his gaze with composure. "I have nothing to conceal, Mr. Holmes." "On the contrary," said he, "you have concealed a great deal, and with remarkable skill." Lestrade stepped forward. But Holmes raised a hand, preferring to proceed in his own fashion. "You have been in Sir Edmund's service for 3 years," Holmes continued. "During that time you gained his confidence, managed his affairs, and acquired intimate knowledge of his properties. Among his papers you discovered a document, one which revealed the existence of a concealed chamber beneath this house." Miss Briggs's expression did not change, but her hands tightened slightly. Holmes drew the paper from his coat and held it up. "This document?" Her eyes fixed upon it. "You sought to recover it just now," Holmes went on, "but you were too late. Its contents confirm not only the existence of the chamber, but the fact that Sir Edmund chose to conceal it rather than exploit it." "And what of that?" she said, her voice steady, though lower than before. "It suggests," said Holmes, "that whatever lay within was not merely valuable, but dangerous, or at least controversial, something which Sir Edmund feared to reveal." He stepped closer. "You, however, saw in it an opportunity. You learned of the hidden passages within the house, passages which connect the chamber below to the study above. You devised a method by which you could both terrify and eliminate Sir Edmund without ever entering the room." Lestrade could restrain himself no longer. "You used that apparatus in the wall?" he cried. "You sent the voice, and the poison with it." Miss Briggs's composure wavered, but only for a moment. "You have no proof," she said. Holmes's eyes flashed. "On the contrary, we have a complete chain, the footprints in the chamber below, small, narrow, consistent with your own. The precise direction of the sound heard only by those within range of the conduit. Your presence among the witnesses to divert suspicion. And finally, your attempt to recover the very document which establishes your motive." He paused, then added softly, "And above all, the ingenuity of the method, a method requiring intelligence, patience, and knowledge of the house, qualities which you alone among this household possess in full measure." A long silence followed. Miss Briggs stood motionless, her eyes fixed upon Holmes. Then slowly the tension seemed to leave her, and with it the last trace of denial. "You are very thorough, Mr. Holmes," she said at last. Lestrade stepped forward. "Then you admit it?" She did not answer him directly. Instead she turned back to Holmes. "You understand more than the others, but not everything." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then pray enlighten us." She moved to the table and rested her hand upon it, as though gathering her strength. "My uncle, Sir Edmund, was not the man you suppose him to be. That chamber beneath the house, it was not empty. It contained records, documents, evidence of transactions long concealed, land taken by deception, fortunes built upon ruin. He knew it, and he buried it, quite literally, rather than face the consequences." Holmes listened without interruption. "And you discovered this?" he asked. "Yes, in his papers. He intended to leave it untouched, to let it remain hidden forever. But I could not permit that." "Why?" said Holmes. Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was something fierce within them. Because my father was one of those ruined by him, because everything we lost, our home, our name, was bound up in those documents, and he would have let it all remain buried." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "That doesn't justify murder," he muttered. Miss Briggs's gaze did not waver. "No, but it explains it." Holmes spoke quietly. "You confronted him?" "I intended to, but when I realized he would never yield, that he would rather destroy the evidence than allow it to come to light, I understood that there was only one way." "The voice," said Holmes. "You wished to frighten him, to force him to acknowledge what he had done." "Yes, and to confirm that he knew I had discovered it. When he heard the words, I saw his reaction. He understood at once." "And then you released the agent," said Holmes. She closed her eyes briefly. "Oh, yes." "And the message he wrote?" I asked. Her voice softened. "I did not expect that. He was stronger than I thought, even at the end." There was another silence, heavy with the weight of her confession. Lestrade stepped forward and placed a hand upon her arm. "I must ask you to come with me, miss." She did not resist. Holmes watched her for a moment, then spoke once more. "The chamber beneath, what lies within it now?" She turned her head slightly. "The truth," she said, "if you have the courage to uncover it." As Lestrade led her away, Holmes remained standing, his gaze thoughtful, his expression unreadable. "Well, Watson," said he at last, "we have our solution, though I confess it is one which leaves a certain uneasiness behind it." "Because of her motive?" I asked. "Because of the past," said Holmes quietly. "Oh, it is a curious thing how often the crimes of yesterday return to shape the tragedies of today." He moved toward the door, pausing only to cast one last glance at the silent room and the chalked words upon the wall. "I know what lies beneath." "And now," he added, "so do we." Holmes did not immediately leave Ashcombe House after Miss Briggs had been taken into custody. Instead, he stood for some time in the study, his long, thin figure outlined against the dim lamplight, his gaze resting not upon the body nor the walls, but upon the floor beneath which the hidden truth lay buried. "It is not enough, Watson," said he at last, "to expose the mechanism of a crime. One must also understand its full consequence." "You refer to the chamber beneath?" I asked. "Precisely. Miss Briggs has confessed to the act. Kisan, we have established both her method and her motive. Yet her final words were not without weight. If there are indeed documents concealed below, documents of the nature she describes, then the matter extends beyond a single crime." Lestrade, who had just returned, brushed the damp from his coat. "She's been secured," said he. "There'll be no trouble there. But I can't say I like the sound of what she's left behind." Holmes turned to him. "Nor I, which is why, before we depart, we must complete what Sir Edmund himself did not." With that, he led the way once more to the hidden trap within the study floor. The panel was raised and a lantern procured. One by one, we descended into the narrow cavity below, the cold air rising to meet us with a damp and earthy breath. The chamber beneath was larger than I had anticipated, a low, vaulted space of rough stone, long undisturbed. Against one wall stood a heavy iron chest, its surface marked by age and corrosion, yet firmly sealed. "There," said Holmes quietly. Lestrade approached it and tested the lid. Locked. Holmes knelt beside it and examined the mechanism. "No great sophistication," he murmured. "Sir Edmund relied more upon concealment than upon security." With a few careful manipulations and the assistance of Lestrade's strength, the lock gave way with a dull snap. The lid was raised. Within lay a collection of documents, bundled, tied, and preserved with meticulous care. Holmes took one and opened it, his eyes scanning the contents rapidly. As he read, his expression grew grave. "Well," said Lestrade. Holmes handed him the paper. "Land transfers," said he, "fraudulent in nature. Properties acquired under false pretenses, signatures coerced or forged, a pattern repeated over many years." I felt a chill as I looked upon the faded ink. "And these are only a portion," I said. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Enough, however, to confirm Miss Briggs's account. Sir Edmund Ashcombe was not merely a man of wealth, he was a man who had built that wealth upon deception." Lestrade exhaled slowly. Then she spoke the truth. "Yes," said Holmes, "though truth in itself does not absolve her of the crime she committed." He closed the chest gently. "This evidence must be turned over to the proper authorities. It will not restore what has been lost, but it may serve to correct, in part, the injustices of the past." We returned at length to the study above. Bailly and I could not help but reflect upon the strange duality of the case, the cold precision of the crime set against the deeper currents of wrong and retribution which had given rise to it. Later, as we sat once more in the quiet of Baker Street, the events of that night seemed at once distant and vividly present. "You see, Watson," said Holmes as he lit his pipe, "the matter resolves itself along two distinct lines. The first is the crime itself, a model, if I may say so, of ingenuity. The use of sound to misdirect attention, the employment of a volatile agent delivered through a concealed conduit, the careful arrangement of circumstances to produce the illusion of the supernatural. All these speak to a mind of considerable resource." "And the second?" I asked. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "The motive, a far less tidy affair. Miss Briggs sought justice, as she understood it, but in doing so she overstepped the boundary which separates redress from revenge." I nodded. "She might have exposed him." "She might," said Holmes, "but she chose instead to become both judge and executioner. It is a choice which, however understandable, cannot be condoned. He leaned back, his eyes half closed. Yet one cannot entirely dismiss the circumstances which led her there. Sir Edmund's crimes were real, and their consequences far-reaching. In the end, it was not merely the whispering walls which condemned him, but the weight of his own past. I glanced toward the fire, where the flames flickered and shifted. "And the message he left behind?" I said. "Do you think it was meant as a warning or a confession?" Holmes smiled faintly. Perhaps both. In those final moments, he knew that the truth he had buried had risen at last to claim him. His words were less a declaration than an acknowledgement. "I know what lies beneath." Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. "A fitting epitaph, Watson, for the man, for the house, and for the case itself." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out into the London night, where the fog had begun at last to lift. "As for the whispering walls," he added, "they serve as a reminder that what appears supernatural is often but the work of human design, though the motives behind that design may be far more complex than they first appear." I could not but agree, for in that singular case the mystery had not lain in ghosts or phantoms, but in the hidden recesses of human conduct, where guilt, ambition, and long-buried injustice had combined to produce a crime as subtle as it was tragic. Holmes turned back, his expression once more composed. "Come, Watson," said he, "there will be other cases, and I dare say other walls that whisper. Let us hope they speak less sorrowfully than these." And with that, he resumed his seat as though the matter were already behind him, while I, for my part, could not so easily dismiss the echo of those words which had first drawn us into the affair, and which even now seemed to linger in the mind like a fading voice in the dark.